Hi, I'm Dr. Vidya Shah, an educator, scholar, and activist committed to equity and racial justice in the service of liberatory education. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at York University, and my research explores anti-racist and decolonial approaches to leadership in schools, communities, and school districts.
Hello and welcome back to the Canadian Culture Wars Report. I'm Melanie Bennett and I have another great activist pedagogy video for you today, but I'm going to take a slightly different angle. Today we're going to look at how this ideology, you can call it DEI, you can call it woke, you can call it anti-racist, you can call it anti-oppressive. There's so many different names and it sort of all jumbles into one big thing. But today I want to look at how this particular political ideology is presenting itself in leadership training, how it goes from the university to leadership training in the education system. And I'm going to do that through some videos from a lady called Dr. Vidya Shah, who calls herself a scholar, activist, teacher. She worked in elementary school, I believe, at the Peel District School Board for a little while. And she has some amazing things for us to listen to today. So grab yourself a drink, grab yourself a coffee, a tea, a beer. I don't care. Whatever you like, settle in and let's go. Okay, as a first video clip, this is a promotional clip from York University. So let's have a listen.
My name is Vidya Shah, and I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at York University. My research focuses on race, identity, and power in educational leadership that aims to disrupt structural inequities that disproportionately harm historically oppressed populations. In viewing leadership broadly, I engage in research with community, with schools and school districts, with ideas, and with structures. My current research project focuses on the tensions, contradictions, and possibilities inherent in anti-racist leadership and school district reform. In particular, I'm interested in questions such as, what are the experiences, beliefs, and capacities of anti-racist leaders? How do anti-racist leaders resist and subvert whiteness? And how do micropolitics operate in initiating and sustaining anti-racist reforms in school districts? When I think about the conditions necessary to cultivate justice-oriented leadership, I am interested in the ways that contemplative and embodied practices allow for greater nuance, complexity, and possibility. And as an activist scholar and former elementary school teacher, I believe strongly in sharing knowledge and strengthening relationships between the academy, practitioners, and communities. In this way, we blur the lines between knowledge producers and knowledge users, between theory and practice, between individuals and systems. And instead, we might engage in the co-creation of knowledges and movements for justice in education.
I think that was a pretty good introduction to Vidya Shah and what we're going to be covering in the video today. I am not going to go and unpick all of the elements of ideology. She talks a lot about white supremacy and whiteness. I have covered that in some previous videos. I'm not going to spend too much time on this today. I'm just going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of some more activist engagement in the education system today. So we're going to keep it pretty lighthearted. So in that case, let's just move on to a second clip. So this clip is from a training that she spoke at, I suppose, but this wasn't so much for education. It was for the Malayali Association of Social Workers of Ontario. And I was particularly interested in this talk because she went over a concept called racial capitalism, which is something I had not heard before, and I thought I would share with everyone. So just in case you were wondering what kind of politics, I keep mentioning what kind of politics, it's a far leftist politics that sees capitalism as the ultimate evil. So we're now going to attach that to race. Now, I did actually previously talk about my understanding of whiteness and white supremacy, not necessarily being anti-white per se, although it gets interpreted that way, but in the literature, it's sort of about how whiteness is a form of cultural capital, and under capitalism, it has more capital associated with it and is marginalizing other forms of social capital, which are uh, non-whiteness, basically. I will post a link to the video where I go over this, but this sort of seems to be similar to my understanding of whiteness. So let's listen to Dr. Vidya Shah talking about racial capitalism.
And it's also connected to this notion of racial capitalism. And so while white people are also racialized, and they may not know that, but while they're also racialized, and the ways in which they're racialized often allows them to be innocent and pure and good and benevolent saviors, right? They're racialized in a particular way. What often happens is that because of everybody sort of, if you have sort of this racial hierarchy with white folks at the top, everybody underneath that is racialized according to the perceived value, economic and social value that we are assigned based on our racial identity. And so as South Asians being sort of in the middle of this racial hierarchy, we are assumed to have greater social and economic value in this hierarchy. And because we can produce more money, because we can, and again, I'm putting all this in quotations in case you can't see it, because we can quote unquote produce more money or have more social cohesion, it creates this sort of place where we are in this hierarchy. And therefore we have more value because we can bring in more capital, or the assumption is that we can bring in more capital. But
So I'm going to just stop it there and say this was my understanding of whiteness and white supremacy in the literature as it pertains to education and social justice ideology. Is what she just described, is that each individual race is assigned a value, a monetary value, but in this case, a cultural capital, and that is how it's linked to capitalism. And so social justice ideology is just an anti-capitalist ideology. Now, I'm not going to make comment on whether capitalism is good or bad, but it's indicating to you where this is coming from. And that way of looking at the world is from socialist texts. It goes straight back to the book I keep mentioning, which is The Critical Turn in Education, from Isaac Gottesman, who does lay all this out. So again, it's not anti-whiteness per se. That's how they're describing it. I mean, it does manifest itself as that in real life sometimes, but it's more about a capital that is associated with race that they're trying to redistribute, just like in the past, Marxists would want to redistribute wealth so that the working classes had more, and so on and so forth. It's similar. It's just applying these Marxist values to race.
All of these ideas are in relation. We cannot understand whiteness that is not in relation to anti-Blackness. Whiteness exists because anti-Blackness exists. So whiteness, this idea that, white folks are pure and innocent and, benevolent and good, needs an opposite. It needs to create this opposite of Blackness, which is deviant and criminal and, defiant and less than. So in order for whiteness to exist as the good, as the moral, as the pure, it needs a bad, an immoral, an impure. So these ideas are in relation. There's no such thing as whiteness without Blackness. Whiteness and settler logics also exist in relation to anti-indigeneity. And so you need to have the civilized white settler. In order for the civilized white settler to exist, you need an indigenous, uncivilized person. They need each other to exist. Model minorities, quote unquote, model minorities are in relation to whiteness and Blackness. So we are positioned in such a way, we were racially constructed in such a way that's in relation to whiteness and Blackness. In relation, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, but we need both of these polar opposite ends to exist in the middle. And of course, all of these systems of oppression, including casteism or caste oppression, are needed to sustain each other.
Okay, well, that was interesting. And then the second part, you have the racial capitalism in the first part. And the second part is, I guess, the moral value that is assumed in all of this. There's no evidence presented that this is a thing, or it's as bad as they present, but you have the quantitative, if you want to call it that, the capital associated with race, and then the moral value. And we keep being told this is a not binary, like and I'm not talking about trans ideology, but this thinking is not supposed to be binary, but it is very binary. It is very black and white. As she described, it's either black or it's white. It's poor or it's rich. There has to be, in their mind anyway, there has to be two polar opposites. And just on a side note, this presentation was co-given with this other guy, Siju Seaman, who I've never heard about, who's a social worker apparently, but from the he's a child protection supervisor at York Children's Aid Society. So this kind of thinking presumably is also an issue in the Children's Aid Society. So I'm a little bit concerned about that, but let's move on. So who is Vidya Shah? Why am I talking about her? Isn't she just another one of these people who have some nutty ideas? And, academia is a place where you're supposed to explore unusual ideas. So maybe she's just one of these people with some a bit silly ideas. But again, that's not the case. Vidya Shah is a professor at York University's Faculty of Education. And York University is on par with OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, which I bring up again and again and again. And as you would have it, she won an award in 2022 from OISE as Mentor of the Year. So this is another award-winning academic linked with some faculties of education which are well known and actually well respected in the field of education, pushing these ideas that are not based in my opinion, they're not really based in reality. They're based in a lot of fantasy around this idea of constructed realities, this idea that there's no knowable truth, that everything is subjective and everyone is an expert in their own worldview. It's not really based in anything really tangible. Okay, so let's go listen to a little bit more of what Vidya Shah has to say about race. Here she is talking with some other people, which we'll cover in this video, in a talk called Brown Complicity in White Supremacy.
We come to you today not as experts in this work, but as people who have been grappling with this for a long time, and as people who will continue grappling with these challenges and complexities and nuances for all time to come for us. We say this in our conversations as we were putting this webinar together. The three of us are so clear about the fact that we have benefited directly from brown privilege, and that we are inevitably complicit in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And so we want to say that right off the front. We acknowledge that there are, as jeewan was saying, brown folks that have been doing this work for a long time as individuals in school boards and grassroots movements in the academy, and that many more of us are coming on board now as a collective to think about what this might look like globally. And we're seeing movements happening globally, which is so exciting. And we want to just position ourselves in this discussion and position you as listeners in this discussion. If you are a Black person attending this webinar, we welcome you and we thank you for taking the time to join with us in conversation today. As jeewan was saying earlier, we have not done this as a collective of brown folks, especially in Ontario and Canada. And we want to just say again, I want to say again that we are truly sorry for that. It has taken us way too long to get here. And we understand and expect that there's going to be a significant amount of mistrust. We understand that as a collective of brown folks, we have been silent and complicit for far too long, and there's simply just no excuse for that. We need to do better because it is the right thing to do, and we need to be held accountable to demonstrate that we are worthy of your trust. We also want to be really clear that we are not here as authorities on anti-Blackness, that we come to you today as people speaking about brown complicity and the way that brown complicity thwarts equitable outcomes and opportunities for Black students. If you are an Indigenous person joining us today, we thank you for being here. And as we said earlier, we need an entirely separate webinar focused specifically on brown complicity and settler colonialism. If you are a white person attending the event today, we welcome you. And we want to be very clear that this is not an opportunity to let yourself off the hook. It's not an opportunity to say, okay, so the spotlight's on the brown folks, I get to take a back seat. In fact, it's a way to further reflect on how white supremacy operates, that you benefit from, the ways in which the mechanisms of white supremacy intentionally divide and conquer us, pitting Black folks against brown folks, against Indigenous folks, and the fact that it's an opportunity for all of us to think about whiteness that you are deeply steeped in is operating in all of our bodies as well, albeit differently. If you are a non-Black or non-Black person of color attending today, we want you to think about how many of the features of what we share today show up for you in your own personal lives and in your community contexts, as there are going to be many parallels that we'll see. But today's webinar is specifically speaking to brown folks. So brown folks on the call, welcome. We want to say that, while we cannot understand the impact of anti-Black racism directly, that we do understand the oppression that we may face based on our own melanin. Today's conversation is not going to be about our experiences of racism. We are not going to share all sides of the stories, and we're not going to share with you the great things that brown folks are doing to support Black folks in this time. That's not what today's about. Today's conversation is explicitly about our complicity in upholding white supremacy and maintaining anti-Blackness. And so some brown folks are going to hear what we're saying today and experience us as race traitors. And we want to be really clear that we're quite okay with that, because if our definition of our racial identity as brown folks is wrapped up in the maintenance of anti-Black racism, then we are happy to let that go. And we encourage all of us to be in a place where we're going to divest from our benefits from a white supremacist system. And so we encourage you to join us today if you are like us, wanting to heal the anti-Blackness that is so rampant in brown communities. Then we must address this head on. And we know that we cannot have a love or a justice without truth. And so today's session is about naming some hard truths.
Wow. Wow. Now, what I heard in this is that she has some serious issues with racism, because she keeps addressing people as a collective based on their skin color, for one, which is ridiculous. But also, she blames the racism that she has, and apparently, according to her, brown people have, on white supremacy, on settler colonialism. So it's I find this very concerning, because this, let me just bring you back to the beginning of this video. This person trains leadership. So when I say leadership, I'm talking about principals, vice principals, possibly some administrative staff in the ministry or in the school boards. That's who she's training. And this is the sort of thing that they're training them to do and how to think, because this is the standard ideology within the education system. That's very, very concerning. So speaking of leadership, there was another person on this particular training, I guess, or I don't know what you want to call it, this video that they put out. There's another person called Jeewan chanicka. Let me just bring this up here. Okay, so he was the Waterloo District School Board Director of Education and was pretty unceremoniously removed from his position very recently under some very controversial circumstances that nobody's allowed to know about. Like, he was just taken out. And it's great that I found this video, because when he was removed from his post, not only were the public and parents not allowed to know anything, and they were very, very secretive at the board, which raises suspicion, but he went and scrubbed the internet from all kinds of videos, public videos that he'd put out. And also, I discovered while looking him up today, images. So he scrubbed the video, tried to scrub the internet, of evidence of his public appearances, images, some texts. So not suspicious at all. But this wasn't removed, even though this was scrubbed from some websites. I did manage to find this video. So here he is. Remember, this is a director of education, so leadership. Vidya Shah, it trains leadership. And this is what a disgraced leader in one of the school boards has to say about brown complicity in white supremacy.
So when we think about what anti-Blackness looks like in Ontario's education system, there's a lot of things that we need to think about. For example, what does you know how we have to acknowledge or start from the place of understanding that as brown folks we have benefited from the labor of Black folks doing anti-racist work. They have paved a path for us to be here. But then when it comes time for us to stand in solidarity, to be able to really be able to speak with and stand up for Black students, we shift towards whiteness and we leave Black folks to do the bulk of the labor on their own. We know how it manifests. Black children being sent out of class, to the principal's office, higher rates of suspensions and expulsions, being streamlined or being expelled, being overrepresented in special education classes, underrepresented in gifted classes. We know all of this because of the labor and scholarship of Black folks. And so we need to talk about as a collective, what are we comfortable with when we talk about, why are we more comfortable talking about anti-racism versus anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism, how we utilize our aspirations towards whiteness to perform whiteness. So we set ourselves apart from the Black community by trying to appear to be more professional, fill in the ideas of being model citizens and hard workers. And we either participate in white supremacy by perpetuating the same outcomes I just talked about. We're silent about it, and we don't actually actively address it oftentimes. So we may lower our expectations of Black students. We might participate in this talk that happens in staff rooms about the angry Black children, or notions of, that kid's like a drug dealer, those kinds of conversations, or the angry Black parent who's always yelling, those types of things. And so we need to think about how we allow ourselves in colonial systems to be used in the systems to keep pushing Black children out.
So you basically described having good standards of behavior and wanting excellence from yourself, right? Dressing well, speaking well, having a high standard for yourself as white supremacy. And as we understand, white supremacy must be dismantled and destroyed according to these people in their framework. And so this is very concerning, hearing this coming from, at the time of this recording, this video, was a director of education in a school board in Canada. So this idea of white supremacy is really, really common in Vidya's scholarly writings. And I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on the literature, but I'm going to go over some just to show you how prominent it really is. By the way, she has a ton. You can go on her York University page. She pretty much lists them out, so you can go read them for yourself. But here we have Reforming for Racial Justice, a narrative, synthesis, and critique of the literature on district reform in Ontario over 25 years. Sounds pretty boring, but when you go through it, if anyone was in any doubt that this ideology is about politics predominantly more than anything else, this paper sort of lays that out for you. She has a graph in terms of the approaches that school boards are using to reform themselves. So right now, the education system is under a period of transformation. This image, this cartoon, shows us exactly what she means by that. So here you have the politics of race evasion, right? So if look, let's just not talk about this stuff. Everything's fine. It's whatever. If you actually have a positive view of what's going on, that's a politics of evasion as far as they're concerned. Then you have the politics of illusory equity, soft reform, colorblind management. Remember a couple of videos ago, I was talking about Dr. Andrew B. Campbell, and that's one, Dr. ABC, talking about he wants you to see race. He's training these master's students that they must see race. Well, not seeing race, saying, look, the race is not important, right? We don't need to see our students as brown or Black or all this stuff. That's colorblind managerialism. That's what they call it, right? That's a bad thing. That's on the end that they don't want. They want to transform it out of education. And then you have the politics of representation and recognition. So seeing yourself represented, I suppose you could put that in other words. And that's, I guess, midway as far as they're concerned. Under that, they have social justice, racial Project's critique of neoliberalism. So here we're getting into the neo-Marxist element here, the capitalist or anti-capitalist element, if you want to call it that. They want the education system to critique neoliberalism. They just mean liberalism, classical liberalism, merit-based. That's what they're talking about in there. And if we're moving along along the graph where they want to go, a politics of anti-racist resistance. Beyond reform. This is where we're supposed to go, politics of regeneration. So turning the education system into a hyper race-focused system which categorizes people on the basis of their color and does what they do in these last two videos, which is expect people to put themselves through struggle sessions based on race, right? And these are leaders which are going to pass that on to their staff, and then the staff are meant to pass that on to students, your children. So this is what Vidya Shah's work is essentially. There's another paper, Subverting Whiteness and Amplifying Anti-Racism, Mid-Level District Leadership for Racial Justice. Yet another paper, Lies, Denials, and Cover-Ups, The Pervasiveness of Whiteness in School Districts' relations with Black and racialized parents. And just one last paper, Anti-CRT, so critical race theory, anti-critical race theory attacks school choice and the privatization of endgame. This is about people like me who are parents who push back and say, this doesn't make any sense. It's demonstrably not working, which I'll go over at some point in a video, has been critiqued by even the Ontario Human Rights Commission in their Right to Read Report 2022 as not helping, actually letting students down, doing this specifically. Now, you're welcome to go listen to more from Vidya Shah. She has a whole podcast series called The Unleading Project. She is a leader in unleading. By all means, go and listen to some of her podcasts. I have. It's pretty eye-opening. A lot of people don't want to listen to this stuff, but if you want to understand what education is about, it's actually pretty eye-opening. She does a good job with her guests to really talk about what this ideology means to these individuals, how they view it. So I would actually recommend it if you're interested in starting to understand how these individuals think. So why is this even happening? I made allusions to the Ontario Human Rights Right to Read Report 2022, which again I will talk about at some point in greater detail. Realistically, I believe a lot of this transformation of education, if you will, comes from a report in 2017 from the Ministry of Ontario called the Ontario Education Equity Action Plan. And this action plan was released or published by the Liberal Minister Mitzi Hunter at the time. And it lays out essentially the whole plan for how education has been completely transformed here in Ontario. So if you want to know why education looks like this today, that plan will tell you. However, it's going to tell you in flowery language about all of this fluffy stuff, making it nice for everyone, which is obviously not how it's turned out. But in that report, they have expectations for staff, so HR and things like that, right? And under their organizational culture change, so the transformation of the organizational culture, transformation to what? Transformation to this new ideology. They see here that they wanted to conduct a review to identify and address inequities in ministry structures, policies, programs, and practice. So again, the flowery language, but what that's telling you is like what Vidya Shah is doing. So like uncovering the ghosts of racism, right? So all of a sudden there's so much more racism because they're uncovering all these ghosts of microaggressions and so on and so forth. So they had to uncover that based on this plan. So they hire people like Vidya Shah to go in and suss it all out, right? They also wanted to establish an equity knowledge network through the Knowledge Network or applied educational research to facilitate knowledge mobilization processes to improve education and leadership conditions and support needed and the supports needed to advance equity. So a lot of words to say they required people like Vidya Shah to come and deliver this to the education system. So this was laid out in this 2017 policy. You wouldn't really understand that based on how they're saying it, but looking back, that's exactly what they wanted to do. They also say they wanted to establish an expert equity committee advisory group to serve as a resource for the Education Equity Secretariat and the school board community. So 2017, the Ministry of Education set up what they call the Education Equity Secretariat, run by a man at the time called Patrick Case. I've made a video series on Patrick Case in the playlist section of the channel. Please go watch it. And that Equity Secretariat is the reason why education has been transformed. So the vision of this man, Patrick Case, who is a socialist himself, he ran for school board trustee on a Communist Party ticket many, many years ago in the 60s. He spent a long time at the Toronto District School Board as a trustee, transforming education there, and worked his way up to developing this role for himself, this Equity Secretariat, to push more of his own ideology. And this is the culmination, the legacy of this man's career. And this is what we're seeing, all of this so-called anti-racist stuff. So that was laid out in 2017 in the action plan. So some other things that they called for were some partnerships to establish knowledge mobilization of equity research and practice. So engaging with the academics like Vidya Shah in developing more transformational ideas for education that we see today. Anti-racist practices for identifying and removing systemic barriers and biases in our daily work that have been identified. And a bunch of other things in this plan. So if you're a parent in Ontario and you're interested in this, you should familiarize yourself with the action plan. But again, at some point I will go over it. It'll be maybe less interesting for people who don't live in Canada or Ontario, but I will lay out where it came from and how it sort of developed and some pushback even within our own institutions. So that is everything that I have for you today. I hope it was useful, and I will see you in the next one.